Aisha was a young nurse who had always dreamed of working in a hospital where she could help people. From the time she was a child, she had wanted to wear the white uniform and be the person who gave comfort to those in pain. She was not born into a wealthy family, and her journey to become a nurse had not been easy. Her father had passed away when she was still very young, and her mother struggled to raise her and her younger brother. Life had always been simple, sometimes very hard, but Aisha had grown up with a heart full of kindness. She learned early that sometimes the smallest gestures of care could mean the most to someone who was hurting. Now that she was working in the city hospital, her life was both rewarding and exhausting. Every day she walked through the long hallways filled with patients, families, and doctors. The hospital was always busy, someone crying, someone praying, someone rushing through the corridors. Aisha was part of that world, moving quickly from one room to another, checking medicines, adjusting pillows, and offering gentle words to anxious patients. She was known for her calm smile, even on the most difficult days. Other nurses often admired her ability to stay patient even when things got chaotic. Yet behind her smile, her life outside the hospital was not easy. She lived in a small apartment with her younger brother, Ali, who was still in school. She was the only one supporting the family. Most of her salary went into paying rent, buying food, and covering Ali's school fees. There were times when she had to choose between her own needs and his. More often than not, she chose him. If Ali needed new books or shoes, she would delay buying herself something as basic as a new pair of slippers. She wore the same old jacket every winter, though it had grown thin with years of use. But she never complained. Her days began before the sun came up. She would quietly prepare breakfast for her brother, make sure his uniform was ironed, and then rush to catch the early bus to the hospital. The bus ride itself was tiring, often crowded, but she used the time to close her eyes for a few minutes of rest before another long shift. Once she arrived at the hospital, she had no time to think about her own tiredness. Patients needed her full attention, and she gave it wholeheartedly. Many times, her colleagues noticed that she skipped meals during busy hours. She would simply smile and say she wasn't hungry, but the truth was she was trying to save money. She had become used to drinking tea instead of buying lunch. In the evenings, when she came home, she would eat whatever simple meal she managed to cook quickly: lentils, bread, or rice with some vegetables. Despite this, she never let anyone at work see her struggles. She carried herself with dignity and warmth, making sure her patients felt cared for. For Aisha, the greatest satisfaction was not her salary or recognition, but the gratitude of the people she served. Sometimes it was just a whispered thank you from a tired mother, or the relieved smile of a child after receiving medicine. Those small expressions gave her the strength to keep going, even when her body felt weak. The hospital itself was a place of constant stories. Every day she witnessed moments of deep sorrow and moments of incredible relief. She had seen families break down when bad news arrived, and she had also seen them cry tears of joy when their loved ones recovered. Through all of this, Aisha remained steady, offering her jacket to shivering patients, holding hands of frightened children, or staying a little longer with lonely old men who had no one to visit them. To her, nursing was more than just a job, it was a way of living with compassion. Still, there were nights when she returned home and sat quietly by the window, feeling the weight of her responsibilities. She was only in her 20s, yet life had placed a heavy burden on her shoulders. Sometimes she wished she could rest, travel, or live without worries. But then she would look at her brother's sleeping face and remind herself why she kept going. Ali was her motivation. She wanted him to study well and have a brighter future, one where he would not have to struggle the way she did. Even though her life was hard, Aisha never let bitterness enter her heart. She believed in kindness. She believed that every good action, no matter how small, had meaning. And perhaps it was this very belief that set the stage for the moment that would soon change her life. One cold evening, As she walked into the hospital for another long shift, she wrapped her old jacket tightly around herself. The corridors were quieter than usual, but the air still carried the familiar mixture of disinfectant, medicines, and the faint sound of machines beeping in different wards. She greeted the receptionist, exchanged a quick smile with a fellow nurse, and then moved toward her assigned area. She had no idea that on this particular night, her simple act of compassion would not only touch someone deeply but also open a new chapter in her life. Aisha was simply doing what she always did, caring for others, giving without expecting anything in return. For her, kindness was not something she thought about too much. It was natural, like breathing. But sometimes, life notices the smallest of gestures, and fate decides to reward them in ways one cannot imagine. That night, while the world outside went on with its rush of traffic and noise, a quiet story was beginning inside the hospital. A story that started with a young nurse, her worn-out jacket, and a man asleep on a chair, unaware that his life too was about to be touched by her kindness. That night in the hospital was quieter than most. The emergency ward was not as crowded as usual, and the sound of footsteps echoed softly through the hallways. Aisha walked with her clipboard in hand, checking on the few patients who were awake. The air was cold, and many of the patients had pulled their thin blankets up to their necks. She tightened her own jacket, the familiar old one that had kept her warm on many such nights. After finishing her rounds, she made her way to the waiting area. This part of the hospital often had people sitting for hours, sometimes even days, while their loved ones were treated. She had seen many different faces there, some filled with hope, others clouded with worry. Most were tired, leaning on chairs, trying to catch short naps between updates from doctors. For Aisha, it had become routine to pass through the waiting room and offer a word of comfort or ask if anyone needed water. On this night, however, her eyes caught someone she had not seen before. A man was sitting on one of the chairs near the corner of the waiting room. He looked out of place. His clothes were neat but slightly wrinkled, as if he had been wearing them all day without rest. His posture was slouched, his head tilted to one side as he dozed off, clearly exhausted. His shoes looked expensive, yet his face told the story of someone carrying heavy thoughts. Aisha paused for a moment, observing him. She wondered who he was waiting for, perhaps a family member admitted to one of the wards. There was no companion sitting beside him, no food box or blanket that families often brought when they expected a long wait. He was completely alone. She continued with her duties, but her eyes returned to him more than once. He had shifted in his chair, as though trying to get comfortable, but the plastic seating of the waiting room was far from restful. At one point, his head dropped forward, and she thought he might fall from the chair. Something in her heart stirred. She quietly walked toward him, her steps soft on the tiled floor. As she came closer, she noticed the tired lines on his face. He seemed older than her, perhaps in his 30s, though there was a kind of weariness that made him appear older still. His breathing was steady, and it looked like he had finally fallen into a deep sleep despite the discomfort around him. Aisha glanced around. The waiting room was cool from the air conditioning, and even she felt the chill through her uniform. Without thinking too much, she gently slipped off her jacket. It was the only one she had, and it was thin from years of use, but it was still warm. She carefully draped it over the man's shoulders. She did not want to wake him or make him feel awkward, so she did it quietly, almost like a mother covering her child. Once the jacket was in place, she stepped back. For Aisha, this act was nothing extraordinary. She had done similar things for patients before, offering them water, sharing her scarf with a child, or even sitting beside lonely elders who had no visitors. To her, this was simply humanity. She did not expect thanks or recognition. In fact, she did not even think about it further. She simply returned to her duties, moving through the hallways as if nothing had happened. But the man stirred slightly in his sleep. Though he did not fully wake, Somewhere in his half-conscious state, he felt the weight of the jacket and the sudden comfort it brought against the cold. It was such a small thing, yet in that moment of weariness, it made a deep impression. His body relaxed, and for the first time in hours, he rested peacefully. As the hours passed, Aisha continued her shift. She checked on patients, responded to calls from doctors, and walked through the halls carrying trays of medicine. The hospital lights glowed harshly, but she was used to it. The night dragged on slowly, as nights in hospitals often do, filled with quiet waiting and occasional bursts of urgency. In the waiting room, the man remained asleep for a long while, wrapped in a jacket that did not belong to him. The staff who passed by noticed but did not question it. They had seen Aisha's kindness before, and it was not unusual for her to go out of her way to comfort someone. By the time dawn was approaching, the waiting room had started to fill again. Family members arrived to check on loved ones, and the quietness of the night gave way to the soft buzz of morning. The man slowly opened his eyes, blinking at the unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment, he looked confused, then he realized where he was: the hospital waiting area. He shifted in his seat, and it was then he noticed the jacket draped over him. He froze, staring at it. It was not his. He held it in his hands, feeling the worn fabric, the slightly frayed edges, and the faint scent of hospital disinfectant mixed with soap. He looked around, searching for the person who might have placed it on him. There were people moving about, but no one seemed to be paying him particular attention. For a long moment, he simply sat there, holding the jacket. A strange feeling filled his chest. He was a man who had lived a life of business and deals, where most interactions were built on profit and advantage. Kindness, when it appeared in his world, was usually tied to hidden motives. Yet here was an act done so quietly, with no expectation attached. Someone had cared enough to make sure he was not cold while he slept, and that small gesture touched him more than he could explain. As he sat there, trying to piece together what had happened, Aisha walked back into the waiting room. She was carrying a chart, her hair pulled back neatly, her face tired but still calm. She did not notice that the man was awake. She was too focused on her work. For a second, their eyes met, and he thought of asking her about the jacket. But something held him back. He simply watched as she passed by, speaking gently to another patient's relative. The man's curiosity grew. Who was this nurse who had given away her own comfort so easily? Why had she done it without saying a word? He was not used to being cared for in this way, especially by someone who did not even know who he was. That simple moment, the quiet draping of a jacket, was about to become the beginning of a story neither of them had expected. For Aisha, it had been nothing more than another small act of compassion. For the man, it was something far more powerful. It was a reminder that genuine care still existed in the world, even in the most ordinary corners. And though he had yet to reveal his true identity, this night would stay in his mind for a very long time. The man who had slept in the hospital waiting room was no ordinary person. His name was Kamal, a well-known businessman and the CEO of a large company. Many people in the city knew his face from newspapers and business magazines, but in the hospital, dressed plainly and sitting alone, he looked like just another tired visitor. He had arrived the night before after experiencing sudden chest discomfort. The doctors had run some tests and assured him it was not serious, only exhaustion from stress and lack of sleep. They suggested he rest for a while, and so he had stayed in the waiting area instead of taking a private room. Kamal was a man used to comfort and luxury. He had built his business empire from the ground up, and with that came wealth, fame, and power. Yet with all his success, his life often felt lonely. His days were filled with meetings, phone calls, and endless decisions. People surrounded him, but most of them wanted something from him: business deals, favors, or money. Genuine care was rare. For years, he had forgotten what it felt like to receive kindness with no strings attached. That was why the jacket meant so much to him. It was not about the piece of clothing itself but about the thought behind it. Someone had noticed his discomfort and had chosen to do something about it without expecting anything in return. That small gesture pierced through the walls he had built around himself. It reminded him of a simpler time, long before success, when neighbors would share food during hard times, and when his mother would gently cover him with a blanket as he fell asleep on the couch. As the morning light spread across the hospital, Kamal remained seated, holding the jacket and watching the nurses move around. Among them, his eyes often searched for the young woman who had covered him. He had noticed her face earlier when their eyes briefly met. Her expression was calm, yet her eyes carried the weight of responsibility. She did not look like someone who had much, yet she gave freely. That thought stayed with him. Later in the day, when most of the waiting room had cleared, he saw her again. She was walking quickly with a chart in her hand, her steps light but steady. He decided to approach her. Gathering the jacket in his arms, he stood and walked over. "Excuse me," he said softly. Aisha turned and looked at him, slightly surprised. She recognized him as the man she had seen sleeping earlier. She smiled politely, the same way she did with every patient or visitor. "Yes, do you need something?" she asked gently. Kamal hesitated for a moment, unsure how to begin. He looked down at the jacket in his hands. "I think this belongs to you," he said finally. Aisha's eyes fell on the jacket, and she realized he had noticed. She gave a small smile. "Yes, it's mine," she replied simply. She reached out to take it, but Kamal did not hand it over right away. "You covered me with it last night," he said quietly, almost as if he still couldn't believe it. Aisha nodded, her voice calm. "You looked tired, and it was cold. I didn't want you to get sick." She spoke as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Kamal stared at her, his heart strangely moved. He had expected some explanation, maybe even embarrassment, but she said it with such simplicity that it humbled him. He slowly handed back the jacket, still touched by the gesture. "Thank you," he said, his voice more sincere than it had been in years. Aisha only smiled politely and nodded before excusing herself to continue her work. For her, it was done. She had not thought about it again. But for Kamal, the moment lingered. As the day passed, Kamal could not stop observing the young nurse. Whenever he walked through the corridors, he noticed her moving quickly from one patient to another. She seemed to have endless patience, speaking kindly to worried families, helping elderly patients sit up, and even bending down to comfort a crying child. She never once raised her voice, never once showed frustration, even when others around her were stressed. Kamal, who lived in a world of competition and constant pressure, was fascinated by this. He thought about the long hours she must be working and the little pay that nurses often received. Yet she carried herself with dignity, as though her work was worth more than money. He wondered what her life outside the hospital was like, what struggles she faced, and how she managed to keep such kindness in her heart. That evening, when the doctor cleared him to leave, Kamal felt reluctant. Normally, he would have rushed back to his office, eager to get back to business. But this time was different. Something about the hospital, about the young nurse, had slowed him down. Before leaving, he asked one of the staff about her. "The nurse in the blue uniform, always in this ward, what's her name?" The staff smiled. "That's Aisha. She's been with us for a couple of years. Very hard-working, one of the best. Always puts others before herself." The words confirmed what Kamal had already seen with his own eyes. As he walked out of the hospital that night, the cool air brushing against his face, he thought deeply. He was a man who could buy anything with money: cars, houses, even respect from people who wanted to be close to him. But what he had received in that hospital was something money could never buy. It was pure kindness, given freely. The image of Aisha stayed with him as he drove away. He remembered her thin jacket, the way she spoke humbly, and the way she worked tirelessly without complaint. He realized she had likely given away the only warm clothing she had just so a stranger could rest comfortably. The thought weighed heavily on him. That night, in his large empty house, Kamal found himself restless. He sat by the window, staring at the city lights, but his mind was back in the hospital waiting room. He thought about the path his life had taken, so much success, yet so little warmth. He had spent years surrounded by wealth but starved of true human connection. And now, one simple act from a young nurse had touched him more than all the luxuries he owned. He decided he could not just walk away. Something inside him wanted to know her story, to understand the kind of strength that made someone so selfless. He wanted to find a way to help her, though he knew she might never ask for help herself. For the first time in years, his thoughts were not about profit, business plans, or new deals. They were about a nurse who had given away her jacket on a cold night without expecting anything in return. The struggles in Aisha's life were still hidden from him, but he felt certain that she had them. People who gave so much often carried heavy burdens of their own. And he was determined to learn more. What Kamal did not realize at that moment was that this quiet curiosity would soon grow into something bigger, something that would change both his life and hers in ways neither of them could have imagined. The following week, Kamal found himself thinking about the hospital more than he expected. Meetings were lined up, papers were stacked on his desk, and assistants kept calling for his attention, yet his mind wandered back to that quiet waiting room and the young nurse who had shown him such unexpected kindness. It was unusual for him. Normally, he was sharp, focused, and never distracted from work. But something about that simple act had shaken him. Finally, he decided to return to the hospital. He told no one about his plan, not even his closest staff. He dressed simply, leaving behind the expensive suits that usually defined his image. He wanted to walk in as an ordinary man again, not as a CEO with power and influence. He wanted to see her just as she had first seen him, without recognition, without judgment. When he entered the hospital, the familiar scent of disinfectant and medicines greeted him. The sound of hurried footsteps and soft conversations filled the corridors. He walked through quietly, not drawing attention, until he spotted her again. Aisha was standing by a patient's bed, adjusting the four-line while speaking softly to the elderly man lying there. Her voice was calm and reassuring, her hands steady. The patient smiled faintly, and Kamal could see how her presence seemed to ease the man's pain. He waited until she stepped out of the ward before approaching. She looked a little surprised to see him again. "You're back," she said politely, recognizing him from before. "Yes," Kamal replied with a small smile. "I wanted to thank you properly. Last time, I don't think I managed to express it well enough." Aisha shook her head gently. "There's no need to thank me. It was nothing." "But it was something," Kamal said firmly, his voice carrying quiet emotion. "You gave away your jacket to a stranger. Not everyone would do that." She lowered her eyes slightly, as if uncomfortable with the attention. "It was just kindness," she said softly. Her humility struck him once again. In his world, people often boasted even about small favors, but here was someone who did not even want to be acknowledged for a genuine act of care. They spoke for a few minutes, nothing too personal. He asked how long she had been working at the hospital, and she told him about her nursing career. She did not share much about her private life, only that she loved helping people and believed her work mattered. Kamal listened closely, feeling drawn to every word. Over the next few days, Kamal found reasons to visit the hospital again. Sometimes he brought fruits for the patients in the ward, sometimes he just sat in the waiting area. Slowly, he and Aisha began to exchange longer conversations. He noticed she never talked about herself too much, but when he asked about her brother, her eyes softened with love. She mentioned briefly that she was the one supporting his education, and that was enough for Kamal to understand that life was not easy for her. One evening, when her shift was ending, he walked with her toward the bus stop outside the hospital. The streets were crowded, filled with vendors and people rushing home. She stood waiting for her bus, looking tired but peaceful. Kamal stood beside her. For a moment, he was just another man in the crowd, not the CEO of a major company. "You work very hard," he said quietly. "Don't you ever get tired?" She smiled faintly. "Of course, I get tired. But when you know that someone depends on you, you find the strength." Her words stayed with him long after she boarded the bus. He watched it disappear down the road, feeling a deep respect for her. That night, Kamal sat in his large house once again, but it felt emptier than ever. He thought about Aisha returning to her small apartment, cooking dinner for her brother, and preparing for another long day. Despite her struggles, she carried herself with grace and kindness, something he had not seen in a long time. The next morning, he made a decision. He wanted to do something for her, not as charity, but as recognition of the heart she carried. He knew she would never accept direct help, so he had to find a way that would respect her dignity. Kamal called his team the following day and announced a new initiative. He wanted to start a healthcare support program that would provide scholarships and financial assistance to the families of hard-working hospital staff. His employees were surprised at the sudden idea, but he spoke with such determination that they immediately began working on it. Weeks later, the hospital received an announcement: a new charitable program was being launched, funded by a well-known company, to support nurses, ward boys, and other staff who dedicated their lives to caring for patients. Among the first names chosen for assistance was Aisha's family. When Aisha received the news, she was stunned. The hospital manager called her into the office and handed her the papers. Her brother's school fees would be covered until graduation, and she herself would be given a scholarship to pursue higher studies in nursing if she wished. Tears welled up in her eyes, not out of greed or desire for more, but out of pure relief. The weight she had been carrying for so long was suddenly lighter. Later that evening, she saw Kamal again at the hospital. She walked up to him, holding the papers in her hands. "Was this your doing?" she asked softly, her voice filled with emotion. Kamal looked at her with a warm smile. "It's not just for you. It's for many others like you who give so much and ask for nothing." "But yes, you inspired it." Aisha's lips trembled as she tried to speak. Gratitude filled her heart, but so did respect. She realized then that the man she had helped on a cold night was not an ordinary visitor. He was someone with the power to change lives. Yet, more importantly, he had the heart to use that power for good. In that moment, something changed between them. It was not just about a jacket anymore, or even about a scholarship. It was about the bond of kindness that had connected two very different lives. Aisha had given freely without knowing who he was, and Kamal had responded with generosity, not to repay her, but to continue the circle of compassion she had begun. The days that followed brought more conversations, more moments of quiet connection. Kamal continued to visit, not as a wealthy CEO but as a man who had found respect and inspiration in a nurse's simple life. Aisha, though shy at first, began to open up little by little, sharing stories of her brother, her childhood, and her dreams of one day becoming a senior nurse who could train others. And though neither of them said it aloud, both knew that their lives had been forever changed by that one cold night in the waiting room when a tired man had fallen asleep, and a young nurse had quietly covered him with her only jacket. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to Aisha's life. She still worked the same long hours at the hospital, still walked through crowded corridors and cared for patients with the same devotion, but now something felt different. For the first time in years, she no longer carried the crushing weight of financial worry. Her brother's education was secure, and she herself had an opportunity to grow in her profession. The relief in her heart gave her a quiet strength that made her smile even brighter. Her brother, Ali, noticed the change too. When she came home in the evenings, she no longer sat silently by the window with tired eyes. Instead, she asked him about his studies with genuine energy and even helped him revise when she had time. The scholarship announcement had lifted not only her burden but also his guilt. He had always known how hard his sister worked for him, and now he felt a renewed determination to make her proud. Meanwhile, Kamal continued his visits to the hospital. At first, he told himself it was to oversee how the new program was being implemented, but in truth, he wanted to see Aisha. Each time their paths crossed, they shared more words, more quiet conversations that went beyond simple courtesy. He listened to her speak about her dreams of becoming a senior nurse, of wanting to train young nurses to treat patients not just with medicine but with compassion. He admired how she spoke with conviction, even though she had never had an easy life. For Kamal, those conversations became moments of peace in his otherwise hectic life. His world outside was still filled with deadlines, board meetings, and business deals, but the hospital had become a place where he could breathe differently. With Aisha, he was not a CEO, not a man with power or wealth, he was simply a human being, and she treated him that way. One evening, after a particularly long day, he found himself waiting outside the hospital as Aisha ended her shift. She was surprised to see him there. "You're waiting?" she asked, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "Yes," he said with a gentle smile. "I thought you might allow me to walk with you." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. They walked side by side toward the bus stop. The city lights glowed around them, and the cool evening breeze carried the scent of roasted corn from street vendors. For a while, neither spoke. It was a comfortable silence, filled not with distance but with understanding. Finally, Kamal broke the silence. "You know, your kindness that night, it changed something for me. I've lived so many years chasing success, but I had forgotten the power of a simple act of care. You reminded me." Aisha looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes we don't realize how much small things matter. For you, it was just a jacket. For me, it was nothing special. But maybe that's the beauty of kindness. It doesn't have to be big to mean something." Her words touched him deeply. He had spent his life in a world where only big actions seemed to count, big deals, big projects, big profits. But she was right. Sometimes it was the smallest act that left the deepest mark. As days turned into weeks, their connection grew stronger. Aisha remained grounded, always humble, never once trying to gain anything from Kamal's position or wealth. And Kamal, for the first time in years, felt seen for who he was rather than what he owned. He found himself admiring not just her kindness but her quiet strength, her sense of duty, and her refusal to give up despite life's difficulties. The hospital staff soon began to notice their growing friendship. Some whispered about it, but Aisha paid no attention. She knew that people talked about anything unusual, but she also knew that her respect for Kamal was genuine. It was not about money or status, it was about the heart she had come to see in him, the man who had chosen to use his success to help others. One day, the hospital held a small ceremony to honor the launch of Kamal's charitable program. Nurses, doctors, and staff gathered in the main hall. Kamal stood at the front, speaking about the importance of compassion in healthcare and how the program would continue to support those who dedicated their lives to serving patients. As he spoke, his eyes occasionally met Aisha's in the crowd. She listened quietly, her heart full of gratitude, not just for what he had done for her but for all her colleagues who now had hope of a better future. After the ceremony, Kamal approached her. "You were the inspiration for all of this," he said softly. Aisha shook her head. "I did nothing. It was your decision." He smiled. "But it was your kindness that opened my eyes. Sometimes one small gesture can awaken something much bigger." She looked at him for a long moment and then smiled too. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what he was saying. Perhaps it was true, her small act had planted a seed that had grown into something much greater. In the months that followed, life began to change for both of them. Aisha enrolled in advanced nursing courses with the help of the scholarship, and she excelled. She balanced her studies with her hospital work, determined to learn as much as she could. Her brother Ali continued to study hard, encouraged by the opportunities now open to him. Their small apartment still remained simple, but the air inside was lighter, filled with hope instead of worry. Kamal, too, found changes within himself. He began spending more time visiting hospitals, talking to staff, and even sitting with patients. His company noticed his shift in priorities, but instead of questioning it, many admired it. For years he had been known only as a sharp businessman. Now, people began to see him as a man of compassion as well. His reputation grew not just in wealth but in respect. And through it all, his bond with Aisha deepened. Their paths continued to cross, sometimes in quiet walks after her shift, sometimes in long conversations about life and values. They never rushed, never forced anything, but day by day, they grew closer. One evening, as they sat on a bench outside the hospital, watching the sun set behind the tall buildings, Kamal turned to her. "You changed my life, Aisha," he said sincerely. "Not with wealth or with power, but with something much more rare. With kindness." Aisha looked at him, her eyes soft. "And you changed mine," she replied. "Not by giving me gifts, but by reminding me that kindness never goes unnoticed." They sat in silence after that, both understanding that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest moments. Their story was not about a nurse and a millionaire, not about wealth or status. It was about two human beings whose lives had crossed by chance, bound together by one small act on a cold night in a hospital. A young nurse had given her jacket to a stranger, and that stranger had chosen to turn his gratitude into something that touched countless lives. In the end, both of them discovered that kindness is not a weakness but a strength, one that has the power to heal, to inspire, and to change lives in ways neither could have imagined. And so their journey continued, not just as individuals walking their own paths, but as two souls connected by compassion, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures leave the largest footprints in the heart.